I am delighted to introduce Emily Austin, who is an assistant professor of classics at the University of Chicago. She writes on Homer, especially emotions, as well as literary depictions of solitude in ancient Greece. Her first book, Grief and the Hero, The Futility of Longing in the Iliad, explores the nexus of grief, longing, and anger in the Iliad. This work begins with a verbal find. Achilles' grief for Patroclus is uniquely described with the My Greek word longing. And through this discovery, the book traces the relationship between grief and action, giving a narrative account for why Achilles' anger is insatiable. Her current research projects include a second book, Solitude and Its Powers in Ancient Greece, which is in progress, and it identifies surprising moments when ancient Greek poetry conceives of solitude as a good thing. In addition, Austin has written articles on Homeric similes and their relation to the narrative, meaningful variation in Homeric formulae, and the power of inactivity in the Homeric hymn to Demeter and the Iliad. Thank you, Professor Austin, for joining us. Please give her a round of applause.
Hi, everyone. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to talk with all of you. I feel like I'm filling some big shoes because last month's talk was so amazing. I wanted to just give a recap. So Dr. Jennifer Newsom-Martin gave us a fantastic lecture on what is Catholic culture. And this lecture drew us into the abundance of God, his roominess, articulating 4 features of Catholic culture that stem from God's own being. So one of the features she articulated was the sacramental value of embodiment and the material. And here she charmingly adapted a quote from Flannery O'Connor, which is about fiction, and applied it to Catholic culture, saying Catholic culture is about everything human and we are made of dust. So the idea of the material. A second feature is its transfiguring, transforming hospitality, the idea that Catholic culture can build on anything. Its characteristic diversity, not monoculture, the idea that it's not a monolithic entity, it's very diverse, and the fact that it teems with life. And the soul of Catholic culture, Dr. Martin argued, is this Catholic vision of the human person's final end, union with God. So that's what gives it its soul. And so for this reason, Catholic culture is particularly oriented to seeing the giftedness in being, to praise what is good, to contemplate, to adore, and to love. I want to build on these principles of Catholic culture in the context of literature tonight. I will begin with some theological thoughts about the incarnation and the unity of being. I'll then take you on a deep but focused dive into some ancient Greek texts, because this is what I work on. The latter part of the talk may feel quite unrelated to our topic. I'll be giving you a lot of context about pagan stories, and I will be close reading some passages about suffering. But my hope is that the experience of reading these texts together can be a meaningful encounter with what it might look like to read Catholically, the mindset, the habit of being that emerges from looking for the truth in this broad, hospitable, truly Catholic way. So that's my hope. Here we go. For me, one of the most exciting things about the faith is the way the incarnation changes everything. Creation already puts us in a fundamental relationship with God. I am a being held in being by God at every moment on every level. So that makes me relational, being held in being by God. That's who I am. But the incarnation takes this relationality and makes it deeper than we can imagine, unfathomably complete and completely transcendent. God taking on materiality, it's a paradox that's true. It changes every material thing. When I was asked to give this talk, I was told, one, you can do this even though you're just a Homerist. That was a phrase that reflected my feelings about myself, not Lumen Christi's feelings about me. And more pertinently, I was told that the series' topic, A Catholic Vision of Culture in the 21st Century, stems partly from an address Pope Benedict gave in 2008 at a meeting with representatives from the world of culture. One of the stunning points that Ratzinger makes in this address is about language. The fact that the second person of the Most Holy Trinity is the Word means that language matters. So I have a quote from this address here. It's broken up so it fits on the slides. So Pope Benedict is talking about the culture of the monastery and the fact that they were seeking, that the goal of the monastery was to seek God. Because they were Christians, this seeking God was not an expedition into a trackless wilderness, a search leading them into total darkness. God himself had provided signposts. Indeed, he had marked out a path which was theirs to find and to follow. This path was his word, which had been disclosed to men in the books of the sacred scriptures. Thus, by inner necessity, the search for God demands a culture of the word. Eschatology, so this is a theological word for the end times and how they relate to the end of man. Eschatology and grammar are intimately connected with one another. The longing for God includes love of the word, exploration of all its dimensions. Because in the biblical word, God comes towards us and we towards him, we must learn to penetrate the secret of language, to understand it in its construction and in the manner of its expression. Thus, it is through the search for God that the secular sciences take on their importance. Sciences which show us the path towards language. Through education, man learns to perceive, in the midst of words, the word itself. So it's a long quote, but I was really stunned by it. In this quote, Pope Benedict claims an eschatological dimension of philology, the love and study of language. He claims that there is a structure of truth and transcendence in language itself. I got very excited when I read this because my field is built on language, the study of Latin and Greek. It was wonderful to hear a pope say that when we study, when we grow as lovers and experts in fields of human knowledge, above all in language, we meet God. This idea spoke to me because I have often tried to understand the Catholic dimension of what I do, study the pre-Christian worlds of Greece and Rome in an incarnational way. At some point in our lives, many of us have been taught about the 4 transcendentals. I thought about quizzing them, but I'll just tell you what they are. The 4 transcendentals: truth, goodness, oneness, and beauty. These aspects of being are ontologically one. What that means is that the presence of one entails the presence of another. Where there is truth, there is beauty. Where there is goodness, there is oneness, and so on. For me, as a researcher and a teacher, the oneness of truth is huge. If I can better articulate the truth of what Homer shows, I am uncovering something big T true. Something that participates in God. This has been helpful to me as a professor, not teaching texts as means to virtue, as if reading will make my students be good. So that doesn't work. But instead, allowing the text to be its real self, looking for what is true in the text, looking for what aspect of God's truth it participates in. And God's truth is, of course, infinitely rich and capacious. We don't find truth in literature or anywhere else by jimmying texts into Catholic script. The more reality there is in anything, truth, beauty, goodness, oneness, the more it participates in the incarnational dimension of all being. So, if everything, insofar as it is true, good, beautiful, or one, is Catholic, why even talk about Catholic culture? I think it's a fair question. One thing that becomes very apparent in these conversations about Catholic culture is our need for the gift of discernment. Dr. Martin spoke about this last month, to be able to judge in a text what faces God and what does not. And discernment is a habit of mind that we learn. So here is where I want to bring up the idea of literary traditions. I think that reading within a tradition is supremely helpful for learning how to read with openness and discernment. This belief comes from my experience as a classicist. My map. The discipline of classics has a canon, a set of texts that we're all familiar with, that we had to study in graduate school, and that we continue to encounter in our own work or that of our colleagues. It's actually quite overwhelming. Classics is not defined by a particular method or set of questions or a unified field of study. Rather, classics is defined by two languages, Greek and Latin, and an ever-expanding time period, roughly 800 BC to 600 AD, although we've just hired a Byzantinist, so now we're up to 1400 AD. Within these basic parameters range a vast array of subfields, authors, genres, and disciplinary methodologies, much to my dismay when I was studying for comps in graduate school. Yet this challenge in classics is also a strength, because as one works through each author in his or her own context, one becomes ever more aware of an ongoing dialogue. These texts are talking to one another. Classics is inherently receptive. I'm a Homerist, and as a Homerist, I have a prejudice to see Homer everywhere. But it is not only a prejudice. The tragedians of 5th century Athens, for example, were receiving Homer, playing with Homer, altering but also revering, unpacking implications, making certain insights and questions explicit, offering counterclaims, so on. This phenomenon of conversation with what comes before was not confined to tragedy and epic. The more authors I read in my field, the more I see how pervasively these texts are marked by awareness of one another. These authors were so intelligent, so aware, so alive to their own dialect. For me, working within a field characterized by receptivity and play is a constant call to be alert, attentive, and humble. These are attitudes that make literature, whether enjoying it or producing it, I think, truly Catholic. They enable us to find that God-shaped aspect of the reality being presented to us. It is so easy to import fixed ideas into how we receive literature and reality, to say, I know that story, or I know what that kind of person thinks, without listening to the author or person in their current moment. But living in a world of fixed ideas blinds us to the actual reality, and so we miss out on the immense diversity of ways that the world points to God. The incarnation touches everything. For me, as a classicist, discovering the manifold ways that the ancients were responding to one another taught me that I have to approach the texts I work on attentively and with care. The mental habits created by working within a tradition are, I think, an essential element of human flourishing. To approach reality patiently, openly, not as something to be dominated, but as something to be received with a kind of alert and perceptive joy. Since my expertise is classics, not theology, I would like to close read some ancient texts from my field as a mini sample of how a tradition can function. So together, we'll spend the next several minutes looking at 3 texts from the classical canon: Homer's Iliad, Aeschylus Agamemnon, and Sophocles Philoctetes. The common questions we will explore concern suffering, the human condition, and the nature of excellence. I hope that the pleasure of exploring how these texts talk to one another and how they require from us balance and care will be itself a kind of argument through experience for you, showing how working within a tradition requires humility and attentiveness. At the end, I will return to the idea of reading Catholically from the point of view of reading within a community. We will begin with the Iliad, a text of my special love and study. The poem comes from a tradition in which one's self-worth is measured by excellence in battle. This excellence is recognized by one's comrades through gifts of honor, and it is sought in hopes that one might achieve immortality through renown, that is, immortal glory. So I made a little schema representing the value system: heroic code, excellence in battle, communal recognition through gifts, immortal glory. That's a very, very schematic understanding, but keep this background in mind. In this framework, the poem explores remarkable questions about the value of human life, the costs of war as well as its beauties, the nature of friendship on the battlefield, and so on. So I'll give you a quick overview of the story. The poem begins in the 10th year of the siege in Troy. 10 years previously, a Trojan prince, Paris, visited a Greek king, Menelaus, and I'm sorry, there's going to be a lot of Greek names just to ride it. So this prince, Paris, he either stole or ran away with Menelaus' wife, Helen, very famous for her beauty, and many kings in Greece banded together to recover her. The Greek siege lasted 10 years. The Iliad tells of just 53 days in the 10th year. And these are pivotal days in that one of the Greek warriors, Achilles, loses a friend in battle, whose name is Patroclus. And this loss, he goes berserk after this loss. And in seeking vengeance, he kills the greatest warrior in Troy, the one who really defended the city. Sorry, there's pictures of his vengeance seeking. And the poem depicts this death as if it's the death of Hector, as if it's the sack of Troy, giving us a foretaste of the impending doom for this city and a sense of irrecoverable loss. This is a very Emily-centric overview of the Iliad. That's what I worked on. There's a lot of other stuff in the poem, but this is what we're going to work with. In the final book of the Iliad, that's my picture of, it's a picture of I love that you see the city behind this dead warrior, them carrying Hector. In the final book of the Iliad, Priam, the king of Troy, enters the enemy Greek camp by night to entreat Achilles for his son Hector's court. Achilles has been relentlessly defiling this court out of grief for his slain friend Patroclus. Yet when faced with Priam's plea, he yields, agreeing to accept ransom and release the body. In this scene, the two men weep together, and then Achilles addresses Priam with mingled compassion and reproach, a reproach that transcends his personal grief to take a long but bleak view of mortals' place in the universe. He describes our human condition with the image of two urns. For thus the gods have spun life for wretched mortals to live in grief, but they themselves are without sorrows. For two urns stand on the threshold of Zeus, from which he bestows gifts, the one urn of evils, the other of blessing. Although the urns are balanced, one containing good gifts, the other evil, the way the gifts are distributed is not. Achilles delineates a worldview in which no one has a perfectly happy life. Some receive from Zeus good fates mixed with bad, others receive bad fates unmixed. Achilles' speech accords with the mortal limitations that have been preoccupying him throughout the poem, and especially in the final books. Notably, at the beginning and end of this speech, he declares that lament has no praxis. This is a Greek word we don't have, but accomplishment. It doesn't do anything, doesn't achieve anything. This concept of the futility of grief frames the story of Zeus's urn. The beginning, he says, or before he introduces the story, he says, "For nothing is accomplished by chilling lament." There's no praxis. And at the end, he says, "So bear up, and do not mourn without ceasing in your heart, for you will accomplish nothing by grieving for your son, nor will you raise him up."
Yeah.
This understanding of action's futility in the face of death is a new insight born of Achilles' experience. And I think that it is a moral achievement for Achilles to get here, since the insight has enabled him to end his fruitless vengeance seeking. But more to the point about receptivity and play, this final note of profound awareness of finitude and mortal limits plays against the typical motivations of Homeric heroes to win glory and renown through great deeds on the battlefield. So I just made a little recap slide here. So kind of keep this in mind as we move forward to the next place. So the idea, can't see my slides, but that we seek glory in battle through personal excellence, yet there's a futility in weeping and vengeance to recover the dead, and this profound experience of human love. So now we will move forward several centuries to Greek tragedy. There are similar questions here about the place of mortals in the universe, about human suffering and action. This genre, so tragedy was invented by the Greeks. It's really cool, just sprang up out of nowhere in 5th century Athens, and all, their tragedies, they're all wrestling with these ideas. So we're going to look here at one point of contact, the conceptual resonance of Achilles' speech with Aeschylus' play The Agamemnon, a tragedy that was performed in Athens in 458 BC. This play narrates the homecoming of Agamemnon, a Greek hero from Troy. So we're explicitly in the same mythical time period as we were in the Iliad. And in its opening ode, the chorus sings a hymn to Zeus filled with explicit pondering about our human lot. Perhaps the most famous maxim in Greek tragedy, which is a line hard to translate, comes in this play. It's the wisdom through suffering line, which appears in this stanza and is then repeated at the end of the ode. This is not my translation. The other translations are mine. This is David Green and Wendy Doniger because I just like this translation so much. Zeus it is that has made man's road. He it is who has laid down the rule that understanding comes through suffering. Instead of sleep, there drips before the heart the recollected sorrow of past pain. It is against our wills that we become wise. Forced indeed upon us is the grace of our gods that sit on their solemn thrones. So these lines are part of the same mental universe as Achilles' speech in the Iliad, part of a story about seeking vengeance, questioning the value of vengeance, and in that human experience, trying to understand man's relationship with the divine. Yet the genre of tragedy is more explicit in its questioning than the Iliad. The chorus here voices particular conclusions that go beyond Achilles' insight, no praxis in limitless weeping. Although Achilles' speech manifests a kind of wisdom achieved through suffering, he has learned that relentless vengeance and unending grief will never bring Patroclus back, and that Patroclus back is what he wants. The chorus of the Agamemnon goes further, from the example to the theological conclusion, so to speak. So there's my Iliad recap slide again. And the Agamemnon. So the idea here is that our lot in life is not only to experience human limits, those mixed gifts from Zeus, the chorus of the Agamemnon says, but to experience a kind of violent grace, instruction, learning through suffering. Not only is the content of the choral stanza more explicit, but the color, the feel is different. The chorus feels almost prophetic, giving us eternal truths, where Achilles gave us like a kind of dreary folk tale. We're in the same mental universe, asking the same human questions, but the tragic chorus pushes us to a new place. We might say that because of the Iliad, we appreciate what Aeschylus' chorus says in a new way. There's a backdrop of past considerations of moral finitude and inescapable suffering. Yet also through Aeschylus' chorus, we see the implications of what was already in the Iliad now explored more deeply. C.S. Eliot has an essay called Tradition and the Individual Talent, where he says that when you're within a tradition, the later works change the earlier works. And this is how I feel about the Iliad and the Agamemnon. The Iliad changes because of the Agamemnon, at least for us as readers who are receiving it. Much more could be said about both of these works, but I hope this brief taste gives you some sense of what I mean when I say that working within a tradition requires and teaches attentiveness and care. So we're going to move on to my third text, the Philoctetes, another tragedy. In a tragedy performed almost 50 years after the Agamemnon, Sophocles Philoctetes, similar questions of human suffering are touched upon with similar resonance to the Iliad, but to different effect. Here the protagonist, Philoctetes, too, was one of the leaders who went to Troy. So again, we're in the same mythical time period, and he has been abandoned by his fellow Greeks for 10 years on an island because he had received a terrible, foul-smelling wound in his foot that causes him periodically to shriek in unbearable pain before losing consciousness completely. This wound won't heal naturally because it's a divine wound. He transgressed a sacred area and was bitten by this snake. So, in these 10 lonely years, Philoctetes has eked out a wretched existence for himself, hunting for food with his magical bow, crawling to what he has shot down, bringing it back to his drafty cave, all without a single companion except the natural features of the island. And one of the things that, my students notice first when they read this is that he's talking to his island. It's the only addresses that he has that he's been able to make. And he also talks to his bow. It's like, what's that movie? Where he's, Tom Hanks talking to Wilson. Exactly. In the course of the play, we see that his wretched, lonely conditions, rather than breaking his spirit, have forged in him a peculiar notion of heroism. Where the other heroes of Troy seek excellence in battle for the sake of glorious renown, Philoctetes boasts of his own private endurance of suffering, which surpasses the capacity of those who abandoned him on the island. There's an example of this contrast about halfway through the play. In a paroxysm of pain, Philoctetes addresses the absent generals, Agamemnon and Menelaus, who abandoned him in that place 10 years ago. Oh, you two double-minded generals, Agamemnon, Menelaus, how would you, in place of me, have borne this sickness for the same length of time? So this quote, you see him sharply contrasting the general's ability to survive such sufferings with his own endurance. Philoctetes declares his unmatchable endurance even more forcefully a little earlier in the play when he invites Neoptolemus into his cave, another Greek name. Neoptolemus is a young Greek, so he wasn't in that original group of people that Philoctetes would know because they were part of the group that abandoned him. He's a generation younger, and he has been sent by the Greek army because they need Philoctetes back to win the war. They've learned, oops, we left him on an island. We need him to win the war. They need his bow. So Neoptolemus is there. He's first trying to see, then persuasion, trying to get Philoctetes to go back to Troy with him. So at a certain point in this dialogue, Philoctetes invites Neoptolemus into his cave so that you may know me, what I have lived from, and how I am by nature strong in heart. For I think that no other man would have endured these things, not even the sight of them, no man except for me. But I have learned through necessity to be content with evils. So strong claim of uniqueness in his ability to deal with this, to accept this. A bit later, Philoctetes is overwhelmed by his illness. If you're translating, that's kind of a relief because it's just lines and lines of him shrieking in pain. But if you're watching, it's totally brutal because there's someone just screaming on stage. So he's overwhelmed by his illness and he falls asleep. And as he's going under, passing out, he begs Neoptolemus not to leave him. When he wakes up, he praises Neoptolemus for enduring these evils in a way similar to him. And again, we see very clearly how Philoctetes frames his ability to endure as a kind of true heroism. For never, child, would I have boasted that this would happen, that you, in pity, would thus endure my sufferings, remaining here and helping me with your presence. Not indeed did the sons of Atreus endure this. The sons of Atreus are Agamemnon and Menelaus. Thus to bear with endurance those worthy generals. But your nature is noble, and you are born of noble men, O child. And thus you considered all of this easy to bear, although you are replete with my cries and foul smells. In associating Neoptolemus with his own heroic type, we see again private kind of virtue in contrast with the worthy generals who, for all their excellence at Troy, were unable to endure the suffering of being with the smell and sounds of Philoctetes' diseased and painful foot, which is precisely what he's been doing. Surviving and dealing with it alone. As the play comes to an end, Neoptolemus tries to persuade Philoctetes to help the Greeks at Troy for his own sake, since the Greek camp has healers who can heal his foot. Neoptolemus says you don't have to keep living this way, alone, without salvation. Philoctetes replies to this by reasserting his enmity against the Greeks who betrayed him. So completely rejects this plea, and he declares, "Let me suffer the things that I must suffer." And at this point, Neoptolemus gives up. He gives up on his efforts to persuade Philoctetes and begins helping him return home. And then we have to have Philoctetes go to Troy because that's what happened. That's how Troy is sacked. So a god appears. It's the famous way you end a play. The god appears and changes everything. So Heracles appears at the end of the play. And in some ways it's frustrating because it's a deus ex machina and they're always frustrating. But it also pulled together this thread of the endurance of suffering and this reframing of it as heroism. So this is the speech of Heracles when he appears, tying Philoctetes' own language of endurance with kleos, glory. First this is Heracles, will narrate for you my fortunes, how when I had labored and passed through so many toils, I came to possess imperishable excellence, as you can see. Also, for you know this well, you had to suffer this to make your life glorious through these toils. This speech both confirms Philoctetes' private notion of excellence and weds it to the more Homeric type, this public kleos, glorious, kleos, the renown that's recognized far and wide. Yet in this rich portrait of human suffering, the play as a whole responds to the Iliad, the Agamemnon, and other texts that make up the poetic tradition of its time. So in the Iliad, Achilles declares that suffering is part of life, and it is futile to grieve endlessly as though that would cure it. Here, Philoctetes declares that suffering can be nobly borne by noble men. Where the chorus of the Agamemnon declares that the gods instruct our hearts through suffering, Philoctetes is told explicitly that suffering will bring him renown, that his life is not only noble, but glorious. So I tried my hand at another schema slide here. So we have Iliad, the Agamemnon, and the Philoctetes. Whatever we think of these conclusions, it's clear that the ideas converse with one another, playing with notions of heroic excellence, of the relations between gods and men, of the place and purpose and nature of human suffering, and of the relationship between such suffering and right behavior. These questions are rich, perennial, and complex. My purpose in sharing these analyses with you is not to communicate a doctrinal precept, obviously, and it's not even to introduce you to the world of a classicist, although I did, and I hope you liked the glimpse. My goal, rather, is to show how Catholic it can be to read closely and deeply. Literature, in its best sense, is something we listen to with everything we are, living, thinking, breathing. It trains us in a way of interacting with reality, just as when we are our best selves, we meet people and look for Christ in them, but not the Christ of our own making. To find God's incarnational footprint all around us, we need to be able to be surprised, to be open and alert. The experience of finding ever more depth in literature and more of being surprised by resonance, remaking, and play among works within a tradition, these experiences are, I think, deeply kept. So here I've stolen one of Dr. Martin's last slides, or part of it, where she quoted from Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture. Pieper here is describing leisure as an attitude, not of the one who intervenes, but of the one who opens himself, not of someone who seizes, but of one who lets go. The surge of new life that flows out to us when we give ourselves to the contemplation of a blossoming rose, a sleeping child, or of a divine mystery. Is this not like the surge of life that comes from a deep, dreamless sleep? And as it is written in the book of Job, God gives us songs in the middle of the night. The attitude of opening ourselves, of letting go, rather than intervening and seizing, these allow us to receive the giftedness of being, to encounter God in what is good around us. And I also wanted to leave us with these two quotes that Pope Francis made in his recent letter on the role of literature in formation. If you haven't read it, it's just so lovely. Really recommend it. He wrote it this summer. And I'll just read the quotes to you. So he quotes Proust about novels. Novels unleash in us, in the space of an hour, all the possible joys and misfortunes that in life it would take us entire years to know even slightly, and of which the most intense would never be revealed to us because the slowness with which they occur prevents us from perceiving them. It's interesting. And then C.S. Lewis. In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with myriad eyes, but it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself and am never more myself than when I do. In the talk description, I assert that Catholic literary culture requires and fosters humility, and that the pursuit of truth is most productively sought in a literary context within a community of friends. Humility and community go hand in hand. I have participated in a book club continuously for the last 5 years, and it nourishes me on every level. I would like to end by encouraging you to read good books with other people. Tackle classics together, whatever that means for you. Build communities of conversation between the people in your group and with the ideas and people who have preceded us. Seek earnestly that your group and your reading practice be one of humble openness. We are not more Catholic when we protect the truth. We are potentially less so, because we might miss the Christ-shaped beauty, truth, goodness, or oneness emerging in the reality around us. Thank you.
So in your perspective, how does the progression of the notion of suffering in Greek tragedy lay the foundation for the future of Christians?
Yeah. I know, I'm really setting myself up for that with how I did this. I did. Well, again, I think it's the oneness of truth is there. So I think there's truth in all three ways of looking at it, right? So it's not, we wouldn't have enough with just the Philoctetes to fully appreciate sort of the strangeness of God. There is something strange about a God who allows suffering also. And you feel that in the Ode and the Agamemnon. And we do experience frustrations with limitations too, whether or not we fight against them. It does feel, like I set up the talk to feel like a linear progression, but I think that that I would want to have the array. It is an interesting play, though. The Philoctetes was written very late in that playwright's life. He was probably in his 90s So that also really moves me. It's a very strange tragedy. So many aspects of it are strange, but I feel like he's really pondering something that maybe you get to later in life. So I'm avoiding answering your question.
It's such a beautiful thought. The sons are walking us through these passages. I was wondering if there are ever moments along the journey of sort of coming to a sense of what a passage means where you're struck by something seeming like a tension with something that you hold true about Catholicism, and how you as a reader sort of move past or deal with that sense of like, well, this book's inclusion seems to be like, that last was, really feel to be true.
Yes.
Like, how do you humbly like dig deeper?
Sure. No, that's why I think reading within a community is really helpful. So obviously, I think that we need a lot of good doctrine. Like, I don't think just anyone can go out there and find truth in anything. Like, we need a lot of good doctrine. We need the community and the tradition of the church's magisterium, which helps us so much, right? We need all of these things, and we need other people. But my experience in the book club is like, I feel like we're reading a lot of things where I don't like a lot of the stuff. Sorry, I'm waving. This is my friend who's in book club with me. But there's a lot of things that I don't like in what we read. But when I have, and so sometimes it makes me never want to read it again. But then every once in a while I'll talk to somebody, or I'll talk to my dad or something, and they connect it in a way that actually does participate in that incarnational dimension of being. But yeah, I just think there's a lot of trash out there that we just shouldn't read. I don't know if that's part of what you're getting at. So I tend to look for people I trust, and they're my starting point for recommendations, and I like work my way in a muddy way forward. And the reason that I work on the sad things in the ancient world is I think there's a lot more truth in the sad stuff than in the happy stuff. That's just my experience from the ancient world. It's a good question. You're pointing somewhere. Oh, over there. Thank you.
Yeah. On that note, what would you recommend as potentially top 5 classics beyond forward that would get you?
Do you mean ancient world classics, or just like things I think we should read?
Ancient world.
Oh, there's nothing except Homer. Yeah, so Iliad and Odyssey, but again, you have to read them in Greek, I think. Although I'm wrong, because I have a lot of friends who are like, not a lot, but there's a fair number of people I know there's a audiobook version of, I think, the Iliad and the Odyssey read by Dan Stevens. Don't listen to anyone else. Dan Stevens. Apparently it's amazing. So I do know people who've gone through it on their own that way, but in general, I'm like, get a book club. Any of the tragedies. But yeah, I mean, obviously, like Antigone and Oedipus Rex are way up there. I think the Oresteia, so this Agamemnon is the first play in a trilogy. I think it's a stunning trilogy. It's one of the only ones we have. We have so little from the ancient world. So the Agamemnon, so I don't know if you guys know the plot of the Agamemnon. It's pretty grim. I usually end my slides with a picture of a puppy and a lamb together, because what I talk about is so grim. So the Agamemnon, what happens to him, if you don't know, is that he, on the way to Troy, had sacrificed his daughter because the gods sort of made him. So it's a very complicated play dealing with that necessity and his responsibility for it. Then he sacked Troy, he comes back, and his wife kills him. So the tragedy deals with these cycles of vengeance, and it's actually totally incredible. So I recommend that. Am I up to 5 yet? I mean, I think most is pretty hard. I actually don't read this stuff for fun very often. I read it for work, and for fun, I read other sad things. I read happy things too. Yeah.
Going off that note, as a classics professor, what modern authors or books do you enjoy?
Well, I am struggling with that. I'm stuck in the 19th century. So we read in my book club some Kazuo Ishiguro, and he's really interesting. I think he's probably a nihilist, but he's interested in spiritual things. So again, probably don't agree with him. If I had a conversation, I probably wouldn't agree with him, but I think there's a lot to be gained from reading his books. So we read together The Buried Giant, but his classic is, what's it called? Remains of the Day. I like that a lot. Yeah, contempt. Like, you really want contemporary, like, alive right now? Wait. Do I like anyone who's alive right now? Man. They're just all so sad. Yeah, we just read The Orphan Master's Son. It's the most devastating thing I've read in a long time. It was really incredible. So about North Korea. It's really good. Can you help me out, Em? What am I forgetting? I mean, the problem is, like, my book club, we got stuck because we read Kristen Lavren's Daughter, and nothing has been as good as Kristen Lavren's Daughter. So good. I mean, I think that reading a lot of the people that Dr. Martin mentioned in a group would be good too. Like, Flannery O'Connor is sort of impenetrable on her own, but I think if I read her with people, it would be helpful, because she's just totally brilliant. Sorry, I'm flanking. I really am stuck in the 19th century. I keep reading the 19th century.
What's people there? Forward.
I mean, I'm just the stuff, Middlemarch. You all have to read Middlemarch. But I love them all. Yeah.
So are the books of the Old Testament or the New Testament and the writings of Homer, are they in some way influencing each other? Do they know of these writings? And are they? When you do read the Iliad, there definitely is, there are some aspects that seem to be incorporated into Christianity as well.
Yeah. So what happened? So Remy Brogg's article, which is also part of what this series is based on, one of the things that's really remarkable, according to him, about Christianity is actually that it's not particularly wedded to a culture. So it's kind of, unlike other things, so, for example, in the Old Testament, like, the whole culture has to be explicitly about being the people of God. So all the rules, everything about how you live, it's explicitly about people of God. And this is not true anymore for Christianity, where we don't have to, there are very few things. We have like the 10 Commandments, and we have the Beatitudes, right? And there's like a lot of cultures that can fit in there. So that's kind of interesting and different. But as to your specific question about whether they knew each other, it seems unlikely, although there are some people who think some of the pre-Socratic philosophers had a little bit of, because it is the interface of classics is, I'm not going to go back to my, well, I'll go back to my, wait, I've got slides. So, sorry, so much Iliad. There we go. So this is like Greece, and this interface is not that far from the Holy Land. But we don't have any signs of it in what we still have. We only have 8% of what we know is written in the ancient world, but we don't have any signs of real cross. Obviously in Egypt is where all the like learning kind of moved into Egypt because of the Library of Alexandria and stuff. And that precedes Christianity and continues through Christianity. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. So a lot of the people who are copying are Christians, but they're not explicitly copying things that are particularly amenable to our faith. They're copying like Lucretius, who's an atomist, doesn't believe in providence. It's really, really interesting that early. Yeah.
The two books that you bring up after Iliad.
Yeah.
Are they building upon that same tradition? Are they adding their own, or Agamemnon
obviously is in the Iliad?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that the other Justin is.
Yeah. Philoctetes, he's mentioned in the Iliad, but he's not there because they left him on an island. So you could easily essentially
Just kind of taking him over and then building these other stories around them.
So it seems like there's actually probably a big story world out there with lots and lots of versions of these stories, and people are kind of instantiating them in these different moments. So of course the Iliad is just towering over all of it, and the tragedians don't quote Homer, but Plato does. The presence of the text is already very important. But in addition to the presence of the text, you just have the story world, and you have a million versions.
What year is Plato with Mo?
So Homer, that's really contested. But 8th century BC, and Plato is 300 years later, 350 years later. Yeah. It's good questions. Gotta stay for comps. Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question from a layman's standpoint. I read the title of this presentation here, and the focus on the culture of humility, which I've been trying to know more about that. But when you hear your lecture here, it's a lot about Greek tragedies. And I'm getting to think here that the point you're trying to make here is that it's only in tragedy that we receive that openness to be able to understand that we need to accept that to realize some level of joy down the road. Am I interpreting
Literature
in the right way?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So there's two ways to answer the question. In a sense, it's an accident that I gave you a lecture about tragedy because I just happened to work on that stuff. And so it's what I know. And so it's where I have experienced the need to be. It's not even just that I've experienced the need to be, but for me, working within a tradition is always teaching me to not assume I know what's going to be happening, because they really are playing with it and it's so dynamic. So it's a kind of experiential humility that I've gained from working the tradition. And so I could have, if I were a different kind of person with different expertise, I think I probably could have given the same scaffolding of the talk with completely different content. But there's still the fact that I gave you the content I gave you. And so about what I think the function of tragedy is with relation to joy, is that kind of part of your question?
Tragedy,
Yeah.
because there's a sense of acceptance and contentment.
Yeah. I think that these things really need the cross to be resolved. And these are pagan societies. They don't understand what Tolkien calls the eucatastrophe. The thing that looks like a disaster is redemptive. So these are glimpses of it, maybe, and there's tastes of it, but also the cross is completely radical. There's just nothing like it, the idea that the tragedy is the redemption. But then Tolkien says all stories participate in it, and I think he's actually right about that. If it's a good story, in some ways, it's telling that story. So tragedy is it's one angle in on a truth that would explode it if it knew that whole truth. Is that a way of...
Sure. No, it's interesting. I think that everybody has one thing they listen to and wonder about it, and I didn't capture the full essence of your comment on this. But what I got a glimpse of was in the case of the Trojan, who refused to really go in and participate in the war there to defeat, and they thought he could defeat the Greeks. The idea was that he could solve his problem with surgery.
With technology,
And the question really comes down from taking it from a Christian point of view and from putting Christ's teaching into this, is that if you forgive your enemies, in some sense, or can move beyond those things that hold you back, there's a chance for advancing and promoting something better.
Yeah.
And so that's just something I captured from it.
Yeah.
And it all fits to what I introduced you with my thought here. But
yeah, no, I love that. I think that you've actually intuited a lot of the play that I didn't even introduce you to, which is this whole, theme of friendship, where Neoptolemus at first is disguising and lying to him, and then by the end, they really are becoming friends. And this return to a community, of course, will require some kind of forgiveness. I don't think there really is a Greek some people think there is a Greek concept of forgiveness, but it's definitely not ours. But there's a proto-forgiveness in the sense of like he not only needs the physical healing of his foot, but he needs the healing of returning to community. And the play is really clear about that need. Yeah. In case. Yeah.
Professor Aeschylus.